Hello, class. Okay. So I've selected these faces on the front, and I'm going to map them with one of the mapping projections. So here, this is mainly a flat view, so I'm just going to select these faces and go to Create UVs, Planar Mapping. And I can choose a few things, what direction we want to project from, and think of this as just a point of view that looks at this object and extracts these faces. So if I look at it from the bottom, it's going to see just a stack of these faces. That's not a good view to extract a 2D representation of it from. A better view would be, in this case, if we look at the little thing down here, it's in the Z direction. So we could use a Z facing camera or a projection to grab those faces. Or we can tell Maya just to use the best plane. So it might angle it and twist it a little bit, but it'll give us the flattest representation of that possible. So I'm just going to keep best plane turned on and project. And so what you can see here is it tries to take, you can see that? Yeah. It looks at this from an angle and tries to fit all of those faces in the 0 to 1 space of the UV map. And you can see that square representation in the world here, that's the projection, and this is what results. Now we don't need this to fill up all of this space, so we can just move it out of the way. We don't even need to worry about it right now, so I'm just going to drag it and scale it down a little bit. But I've mapped that now. I can grab this and just rotate it. But we've got a representation of those faces now. In 2D space, that's useful to us because we can see the shapes, and I can paint over here later on. And I'm eventually going to move everything into this 0 to 1 UV space here, but for right now I can just put everything outside. Now if I select this object, you can still see all those other, from the automatic mapping, all that stuff is still there, but these faces have now been moved outside here. So even though these look like polygons, if we want to manipulate them here in the UV texture editor, if we right-click over them, instead of selecting vertex, we can select UV. And if I want to select these, I can now move these around in 2D space. If I want to select the entire shell, so this whole little group, I can either select all the way around it, and you can see the UVs are selected here in 3D space too. But a lot of the time it's hard to select just, if I tried to do that here, I would end up selecting some other stuff. So a quick way to do this is just to select a few UVs and then hold down Control, right click and say go to shell. And we'll select the entire shell. So again, and I can select them in this world too. I can go here, select a few, let's say 2 shells. So I can just select one here. It's this little group, and if I Control right click to shell, oh, it's this one here. It's actually 2 groups. So I can select those and move them. So I'm going to do this other back face here, the inferior articular surface. So go to face mode, edit, paint selection tool. So I selected those on, just make sure I didn't select anything else by accident. That's pretty good. And then I can just do that planar map again. So it's made a projection that fits that. And you can see now that I just have those faces selected, I only see those faces in the UV texture editor, so don't be alarmed if they disappear. They're still there. So I can just move it out of the way. Now another thing you might want to do while you're working on this is click on this button here. This goes from wireframe to a sort of semi-shaded mode. So if I click on that, you can see they all turn blue. But they can also appear red because, remember, this is a 2D representation of the surface. This is looking at the outside. When it's blue, you're seeing the outside of the model. If you see something that's red, it means you're looking at the inside of the surface, and you want it to turn everything blue. So for example, if I take these and I flip them, you can see I flipped the UV, so I'm looking at the inside surface. So if I was making my glove, there's the leather on the outside and there's the felt lining on the inside. This is the felt lining. And we don't want to deal with the felt lining, we just want the fine leather. So we can flip it back. These little buttons up here flip your selection vertically or horizontally. Yeah?
I noticed when you scale, is there a way, does it matter that you have to keep it like length and width ratio has to be the same, or does it not really matter when you scale it down?
Well, you should try, you don't want to compress things too much because you want to keep the relationship between the shape and size of the polygons to the shape and size of their representation in UV space sort of similar. So yeah, it's actually a little, when you go into scale mode, if you just grab the middle one, it does automatic uniform scaling. But when you do the projection, so if I just go back here and if I want to select that projection again, oops, and hit T on the keyboard, nothing will happen. Don't do that. Select. So there's the selection again. If I select the name in here and then hit T, it will show me that thing again. So you get this weird manipulator that if you hold this down, it doesn't actually lock it into any sort of uniform. I think if you hold down Shift, oh no, even then it doesn't. Well, that's horrible. It would be better instead of scaling it here just to hit R to go in scale mode. Select these UVs, scale them that way. So you keep a uniform relationship among the shape and size. So one thing I haven't done yet is put that shader on here. So I'm going to put a new shader with that checker map. So I'll put a blend on here, so I'll go to Assign New Material. So I'm right-clicking over the object, Assign New Material, create a blend. And then in the color attribute, I'm going to click on the little checker box. And I put that texture in my text folder already. So when the visor comes up, this is not a procedural texture anymore, this is a file texture. So just select File. And when the File node opens up, we can click on the browser folder icon and select checker map. And so now we've got that checker map on here. So we can get a... Now, because I did the automatic mapping, it's done a pretty good job of laying it out already. And that's one way to start. You can do an automatic mapping and then start sewing pieces together. And I'm using this partly as a demonstration of some of the different tools. So if we just look in the hypershade here, look at this blend. So we've got the blend with the file texture going into the color channel. And then if you needed to reload this, you can just click on this file texture and you get back to this area. It shows you the path to where that node is, that file is. So now I want to map this, the lateral and sort of inferior aspect of this, although it's done pretty well already. I could do just by selecting all of these and doing a planar map, or I could try doing something like a cylindrical map. So let me just do that for the sake of showing it. So again, I'm going to select these faces. Paint selection tool. The reason I'm choosing the cylindrical map is because this has somewhat of a cylindrical shape, because it turns down underneath this way. And I don't know if this is the best way to do it, but I'm going to try. Okay, so I just want to make sure I didn't select anything else by accident. So now instead of using a planar map, I'll go to Create UV's Cylindrical Mapping. And just project. And you can sort of see in this representation it's trying to put a cylinder around it in a totally useless way. Because the cylinder I'm imagining is kind of wrapping around this way. But it's put the cylinder you can see here wrapping around sort of longitudinal way. So I have to twist this into position. And already I'm thinking this is maybe not the best way to do it, but I can rotate this, and you can see how it's changing in the UV editor. So I'm going around, I'm rotating this manipulator. Just going to scale it up a bit. And this little T here, this is a little toggle that goes between this normal transform node to move this around. If I click on it, then I can change things like the width of this, and this little red one on the end changes the sort of extent of it. So this is doing a pretty good job spreading it out, except it's kind of compressing all of these ones up at the top here, but they are smaller polygons. So I'm going to say this is okay. Let's see how it does. I'll select some of these UVs and control right-click to shell and move them out of the way. The one thing you want to avoid in UV mapping is overlapping UVs. And one way to get rid of those is to select them and then unfold the geometry or relax the geometry, or sorry, relax the UV map. And that just means avoiding overlap. So if we go to in the UV texture editor under polygons, I can go to unfold here. And you can set some rules like pin the UV border. So if I don't want the border to change shape, I can click that on. I can pin the UVs, which means they won't move as a result of this action. But I've got them all selected, so I don't want to pin them. And I can pin the unselected ones, so you can change that. I'm just going to turn that off. Then I'm going to unfold vertically, so I'll just apply. And you can see it tries to evenly space them a little more. Then I can unfold them horizontally. And you can see it spaced them a little bit. But that gives me a pretty good representation of that cylindrical object, but laid out flat in 2D. Scale this down a bit.
So as you're doing this, is it pulling all the UVs out of the existing sort of puzzle pieces?
It's exactly. So when you map them, it remaps them. So the previous mapping is just gone. So it's a very ethereal sort of thing. It's not actually a quality of the surface. It's something you're applying to the surface, so it can change at any time. It's good.
And can you, like, if you wanted to, could you select small pieces and then say, like, put all these pieces together?
Yep, so let's do that now. So I'm not going to go through the whole mapping process because it'll take a little too long. I'm just going to show you some of the things. So I want you to try to do this using UV mapping, or using planar mapping, cylindrical mapping. And then once you've done that on these different places, and you have to decide the best way to do it. So the three main tools you're going to need are cylindrical mapping in one or two instances, mostly planar mapping, and then unfolding. So for example, this part up here, the spinous process, I could do as two maps. one facing this way, sort of laterally, or toward the medial direction, and one superiorly facing down here, or I can try and do them all together. And I'll try and do them all together just for now. And then I'll show you the last thing you need, which is sewing UVs together. So I'm just going to go into my paint selection tool. This is one of these things that actually I avoided learning for many years because I hated doing this. But once you actually start practicing it, it's not that difficult. It can just be a little bit time consuming. But what it will do by practicing this way is it will inform how you model something. You'll think about modeling and topology and how it's going to ease your UV mapping in the long run. So I'm just painting up these faces that I want to map, and so I'm going around the base of the transverse process here. I'm being a little bit not so careful. I probably don't want these edge pieces in here, but I'm going to grab them anyway, just to see what happens. Just going to grab a few. Luckily, selections are undoable, so you can get back if you lose your selection. Okay, so let's say I'm happy with that, and I'm going to try, in this case, to do a great UV planar mapping. Even though it's not really that planar, I'll see what Maya can do with that. So I'll tell Maya to use the best plane again and project. And so it tries to, and you can see that it's done a pretty good job laterally. It's actually done a pretty good job here too, with the trend. This is the superior articular facet. So I can just move this out of the way, but I can also fix it up by unfolding it a little bit. So I'll go to UVs, select, control right click the shell, and I can try unfolding a bit. Just see what it's going to do here. So it spreads it out a bit. I can hit it again, try horizontal. So that's pretty good. And I know there's no overlap. Oh, there's a little overlap, because if I zoom in here, I can see a little purple and red. So if the red side goes over the blue, we get a purple section, so I can just pull that out. So once you've done all the pieces inside the vertebral foramen, spinous process, the lamina, the vertebral body, and everything, you want to arrange these things so they're all sort of similarly sized. If we click on this button here, this will try and arrange these things and scale them so they exist at the proper scale. Now you can see that it made them all enormous. They all have to fit inside here. But at least they're at the proper scale now. And that's this little sort of Tetris-looking kind of thing, or FJ. But if we select all these UVs, I can now scale them down. Don't do that. And scale them down. And eventually I want to get them into this space. And you can always do this right at the end. You can keep working at different sizes. But eventually you want them all to fit into here. So you can see that it's getting kind of evenly laid out. This looks good. I've got my seam going along here, but this is nice and evenly laid out. The top part of the lamina is pretty good. But what if I want to attach some things? Like I've made the two, the inferior and superior faces of the vertebral body, and maybe I want to attach them here to the lateral and anterior aspect. So we can start sewing things together. So here's that part of the vertebral body. I'm just going to move this over here for now. And then I want to select this part of the face, and I select it in the world here, and then I can see the selection here, so I know I'm selecting the correct shell. Right, control, click two shell. I'm just going to move them over. Now, I have to figure out which edges I want to sew together. I can see here that there are edges going along here that could match up. So maybe I want to sew some of those together. I'm going to go out of 6 mode, just go into 5 mode for a minute. And I'll select an edge. So if we look in here, when I selected that edge, you can see it's faint, but you can see that edge is selected here and that edge is selected there. They're the same edge. They're just separated like pieces of cloth that would attach along the seam. But I can sew these together now to get rid of that seam. So select shell. But I want to put them in approximation to each other first. And I can change the orientation like that. And then I can start to sew them together. So if I go to edge, if I select this one edge, you'll see it selects both because they're the same edge. And then this button here, I don't know how to describe it, the one that I'm pointing at, will sew UV edges together. Or you can go under polygons, and all this stuff is down here. Sew UV edges. And it will sew them together. And I can select this one, hit G, and it will do the same thing. I'm going to go back into 6 mode for a second so you can see what it's doing. So we're getting rid of the seam here. So it's flowing smoothly from one side to the other. But if I keep doing it, hit G again, you can see it connected it here. If I keep doing it, it's going to have to force this to change its shape. And so I can only go so far before I start deforming and smearing the texture over the object. So if I connect this one, hit G, and then this one, G, this is, you can see I'm stretching out these polygons, or these representations of these polygons, and I'm getting some badness here. So you can't, just like you couldn't take a glove that's all cut up and just sew everything perfectly together to get rid of those seams, you can only sew parts of this together. So you can minimize the seams in areas where you're going to see it most, like in this sort of lateral aspect, but you can't make it go everywhere. So let me just do this other side. So I know it's going to be something like this. If I go to edges and select this edge, interesting. So let me select this edge. Yeah, so it's this one and this one. Now if these things are separated from each other, I could just select this edge, and instead of going to polygon sew UV edges, I can say move and sew UV edges, so we'll pop them together. This can work sometimes, but sometimes it will twist this so half of it is right underneath here, which can cause problems. So a lot of the time you just want to move it yourself. Polygons, sew UV. Now I can see that the scale from this one and this one are off a little bit. I might want to select these and maybe scale it up a bit. Don't forget that. So I want, what I'm looking for is this size of, say, this square with the 1 in it. It should be about the same size as one of the squares over here and over here. The orientation doesn't really matter, it's just getting the size generally correct. And the reason for that is we're going to take this as a guide into Photoshop eventually, not today. And when I paint a paint stroke over here, I don't want a slight motion here to make a big change on the 3D model and then have a tiny change over here. You want it to be evenly spread, so a brush stroke will be equal anywhere on the model. So what would be left for you to do, and after lunch I'd like you just to try to do this, and I can come around and help, because I think watching me is only going to have limited value. But to go through and map all these different areas and sew it up in such a way that you make a comprehensible representation of the surface of this object and lay it out into this space. So eventually, once you've sewed it up as much as you can do that thing, whoops, when you select all the UVs, scale them so they're at a similar scale. And then arrange them so they'll fit into this 0 to 1. You can see when they're much bigger how it changes this map. It's covering, this map extends out infinitely in this world. And when these spaces are much bigger, more of that map can fit into each one. So if I scale this down, as it gets smaller, less of the map is fitting on the whole model. Let me just show you one more thing, then we'll stop. So what you want to avoid when Josh was asking about scaling, this is when scaling becomes important. So if we find an area like right here on the 1, if I select this UV, which is right here, I've got these 4 representations of the polygons here, which is right here around the number 1. If I disproportionately scale one area over another, we'll get pinching in our map. So if I take this and move it over, you can see how the map adjusts, and it tries to, less of that colored map can fit into this region and more is spread out in this region. So we get the one spreading out over here and being compressed in here. So that's why we're trying to keep these things evenly spread out. Nothing, when they're close together, more gets spread out. So we're trying to keep things even, equally scaled, and avoid this. If you see this anywhere on your map, something that's dark blue, it means you're seeing this blue and this blue overlapping. If you see it like this, it means part of the undersurface is folded over. And if you have even this much overlapping like that, Mudbox would not accept this. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. You can use unfolding to help that, but while you're working, I want you to try and do that. Planar mapping, cylindrical mapping, unfolding, and sewing. And you're done. Practically does itself. So it's 1:45 now. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
I missed how you got the color
Okay.
number amount.
So that is here, this is the shading. So turn that off, it just goes into wireframe. This goes into the shading mode, which shows red on one side and blue on the other.
Oh, sorry, I mean like the number map for the actual object.
Oh, okay. So if you just assign, and this is in that folder with the shared material. You can just put any kind of new material on here. And the reason I put a blin on, because I find modeling with a specular on it helps see the surface wrinkles a little more. But under color in the blend, if you map, and this is a file texture, it's a JPEG, so we don't want to map a fractal or anything, we want to select a file texture here, and it creates a new file node. And then in that file node, there's the image name, and then you can navigate to it. And if it's in your textures folder, it should take you right there, and then it will place that on there. And then if you lose this selection for some reason, you can always find it again in your hypershade. Excuse me. If you just map out this new blend that we created, it's connected here. Here's the file node. If you double click on that, you can open it up in the attribute editor and you can map to it again. Or you can map to something else. Put a picture of the vertebra on the vertebra, blow your mind. And you shouldn't have to change the 2D texture node because all it's doing is doing a one-to-one mapping of this into the UV space. So 0 to 1 in V, 0 to 1 in U.
How did you get the auto mapping earlier?
So if you want to auto map something,
Because when I went into mine, it just a bunch of
just like craziness.
yeah.
So when you're just modeling freeform and you're not planning, there are ways to plan the UV mapping into an object. So when you're creating something using a NURBS modeling, like an extrusion, not a face extrusion, but like a circle along a curve sort of thing, or the lofting that we used to create this, or at least I did in the video, that will create a perfectly clean UV map, because anything that starts as a NURBS is always a square patch, and Maya will remember that. But usually when you're modeling, that kind of gets lost in the process after a while. So that's why you just get all the craziness, because when you extrude or cut edge loops, it just makes more and more divisions in the UV map. So if you want to take something into Mudbox, for example, and not go through all this process of making a sensible map from the get-go, because you can always do it after, you can just select your object and go to Create UVs, Automatic Mapping. And the defaults are fine. It will make 6 projections from all the sort of cardinal points. And project. So these are the views that it's using, these 6 planes. It's looking at your object. And it will create this, which is somewhat sensible. You can see that piece there that I was modeling, the vertebral body faces, spinous process. But still, you'd have to do a lot of sewing to minimize the number of seams. But this is sometimes a good way to start with an automatic map and then sewing things together. So you can try it that way too. That would be fine. Everything is evenly spaced, so the relationships among things are good. But if you just had to take this into Mudbox quickly, when you can't have any overlapping UVs, you can do a quick automatic map, go in there, do your painting, and then you can always change your UVs afterwards. But the better process, I think, is to do your UVs first and then go into something like Mudbox. Any other questions? Yeah?
Could you show how to do that polygon reducing at the very beginning when you had all that?
The polygon reducing?
Or like when you initially opened the UV texture editor?
And it was all crazy?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I just did here. So if I just open this again, so it looks like this, right? You can see the hints of its origins. There's like some clean UVs in there, and some stuff probably from when I lofted that surface together. This is probably that initial loft, so it's nice clean UVs, but then since then everything went crazy. The reason these things look good is because I did a planar projection when I was setting this up, and I saved after that. So, but if you want to do a quick automatic mapping, select the object, create UVs, and automatic mapping. And then you can see it change here quickly into a layout of these objects. And the only reason we go past this is because this just has too many seams between things. Like this could surely be connected to something else, as can this. It doesn't minimize the seams. Otherwise, there's going to be a seam going around all of these little individual elements. And when we come back after Thanksgiving, we'll start painting and sculpting. But we need the UVs to be good for that to work. Any other questions? No? Okay, so let's break. It's been a long morning. Thank you. And we'll come back at around 10 to 2, and then all that's left to do is to work on this, either on my model or you can work on your model if you want. Ultimately, you have to do your model for finishing up the shader on that. So if your model is done, that's great. And you have to turn in your model to me at some point today. Yeah, and we'll work on that for the remaining couple hours of the day. Great. Last minute question.
So if we're doing our own model, do you recommend us deleting half of it again?
Yeah. Yeah. I know you probably tweaked it a little bit from one side to the other. So in terms of the workflow, what's going to save you more time? In this case, I think deleting half of it and then retweaking it. Because UV mapping both sides will take longer than tweaking it. Unless it's hyper tweaked. I don't know if it's super tweaked.
It's all deformers.
So if it's all deformers, you can just turn off the deformers, hide them, and then you can use them again, and it will bring it right back.
What about we can merge them together when we do the mirroring and at the end This is one object now. How do you delete half of it?
You can just select half the faces and delete them.
No.
Or if you're super happy with the way it is, then you can just UV map the whole thing. It just means doing in the things in the middle, like the superior surface of the vertebral body, that's just still one planar map. That wouldn't make a difference. But for doing the outside edge of the barrel, you'd have to have a different cylinder. So, but you'd have to do each transverse process separately. You have to do both sides of the spinous process. So it'll be a little more time in terms of UV mapping. That's up to you. So you can do it that way. You'll be a better UV mapper by the time it's over because you're going to do extra work. But in the future, I think, and I'm not saying you should have known this. Either way, I wanted you to go through the process of making the entire model. But if you're modeling something that's symmetrical, you would do half, do the UV mapping, and then merge the two sides, then make the two sides. So you can do that either way. It doesn't matter to me.
So in the your tutorial, when there was this one point where you duplicated special, and then you delete that, and then at the end you mirror it instead.
Yeah.
So duplicating doesn't really merge them.
In that case, I was duplicating it, and I made an instance, which means that if I made changes to the shape on one side, I could just pre-visualize what they look like. Now, I could have made that into a copy at that point, and then just merged it myself. But instead, I just deleted it and did the mirror geometry action, which essentially just automates those two steps.
Okay, so it's not different.
No, it's not really different. But the one other, when you make an instance, it shares the same shape node. So before you merge them, you'd have to turn that instance into a copy, so it has its own shape node, and that's under convert instance to object. So it was easier just to delete it and then mirror the geometry and merge them. Okay, great. Oh, I should stop recording.